Hello, you are now entering the infinite void. Hang on tight. We cannot save you now.
Hello and welcome to The Infinite Void. So today we are joined with two guests. We have got the lovely Graeme Rendall, who is a writer and aviation specialist. These are Dave's notes. And we've got Andy McGrillen, who is the host of the UFO podcast. So how are you guys doing?
You're close. It's that UFO podcast.
Oh, that UFO podcast.
I'll give you that one. Yeah, I'm good.
Good,
yeah, I'm fine as well. Thank you very much. I wouldn't say I'm a sort of specialist or an expert, but I'm probably the nearest thing they've got. So there we go.
Quality. So, how did you guys get into UFOs and UAPs then? What sparked the interest for you guys?
Okay, I sort of got into UFOs when I was about 9 years old, so that's the mid 1970s.
Wow. Okay.
I was interested in science fiction. I was reading science fiction books there, and my mother bought me a book that looked like the ones I was buying. It had a picture of a spacecraft on the front of it. And I thought it was fiction, but when I started reading it, it was non-fiction. And it was about things that supposedly had happened. So I got into it that way by simply reading about. I didn't have a sighting of myself, until a few years later. But I was quite interested from an early age. So yeah, it just went on from there.
Cool.
Yeah, I had an interest in just like mysteries and worldwide phenomena, and like the pyramids in Egypt and Loch Ness monster being Scottish and stereotypical, all that kind of stuff, and it kind of segued into aliens from a young age. I had a sighting as a kid that kind of really sparked it being kind of lifelong, and it was with people who aren't necessarily into the subject. So if you want me to discuss that very quickly, I can tell you about it.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So it was mid-90s when I was about 9 or 10. So I'm 20 years younger than Graeme, just to get that in there. And I was leaving the BB, like the Boys Brigade, and it was me, my mum, my sister, a friend, and his mum. We were crossing the road in a very built-up, busy area, winter, late at night, 9 o'clock-ish kind of thing. It was like mid-90s. I don't know the exact year and month, all that kind of stuff. It was winter. And anyway, we look along the road on a clear night, and at the end of the road, maybe half a mile, there's just houses, and then there's like a football pitch and a university behind it. So it's a really built-up area. It looked like what was a Ferris wheel from like a carnival. I'm talking about on the ground though. It wasn't high in the sky,
Okay.
but it was at an angle. So like that, maybe 30, 45 degrees, and spinning really, really fast, like a washing machine would go, right? Like a kind of disc. And there was these lights firing round, and obviously looking along, and I just remember the conversation being kind of like, oh, look at that, what's that? And my mum still remembers it to this day, and she has no interest in this subject whatsoever. And I can ask her anytime, and she'll go, oh, yeah, but I mean, yeah, we saw something. And I'm like, but Mum, can you remember what that was? You saw like a big disc type thing spinning on its side at a ridiculous speed. And she was like, yeah, but, it could be anything. It's not going to be aliens, is it? And I'm like, well, I'm not saying it's aliens, but we certainly saw something that was really, really, really strange. Pretty close as well. And her point was always, but we never heard anything about it. Nobody spoke about it. And my point was always, but we didn't. There was 5 of us. We didn't. There was no camera phones. No one had mobile phones at that point in the mid-90s, really. They weren't like commercial as such. We didn't report it. You don't go home and phone the police and tell them you saw a UFO. Yeah. Like, what's the point? And we just kind of stood for 30 seconds, a minute, and then went home. So after that, I kind of had my lifelong interest in the subject, and yeah, that kind of got me into it.
That's really interesting. Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask, actually, because I've been interested in this subject pretty much since I was a kid as well, and because my dad is American and he's like massively into the Air Force and everything, so I grew up learning about like, oh, we might have these secret projects and we're doing all these cool things. So like, I just grew up like fascinated with the idea of like traveling to other planets and all this kind of stuff. So, but one thing that I was really interested in when I was like looking into like people when they have these experiences or when they've seen a UFO, is they sometimes note how like they felt mentally. Like they've stated that like either they felt like peaceful or like the area around them has gone silent, like the animals have gone quiet or stuff like that. Did anything happen like that with you, or was it just it was there and then it wasn't kind of thing?
No, it was, and that's the thing. We never saw it leave. We left.
Oh, okay.
This thing was literally along the street, and it's one of those, great regrets that if I could go back to that now, I would love to do it. But you wish you'd done something different. I was only a kid, but I was old enough to know what we were kind of looking at. Nah, there was nothing like, eeriness. None of the lights turned off. There was cars driving up and down the road. There was the takeaway next to us, like a local shop, community centre. It's a built-up area. We're not out in a field or a wood or nothing strange happened. No lights over the top of us. Clear night, and this thing just happened to be along there at the end of the road. Loads of other people would have seen it, but then obviously that begs the question: does everyone see the same thing? So,
yeah, no, that's really interesting, because that was something else that I found when I was doing a bit of research on this, was some of the experiences that people have as well. They have been like conscious as well. Like some people have said they've seen something, but they're not sure if they've actually physically seen it or if they've kind of like imagined the experience, kind of thing. So I was just interested in what kind of experience you had. But no, that's really cool.
I think you only know that the people that come forward are the ones that you feel that they know what kind of experience they've had. So it can run from something that's life-changing to something that's quite mundane. It'll be the people who it hasn't affected. Maybe the people who don't come forward, they may be the people that you would need a bigger kind of subset of data to be able to work that out.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at my experience, I saw it looked like it was a teardrop on its side, and it was orange and white. And I saw it go through the sky, but it was going very, very slowly. And I was interested in aircraft. I was about 12 or 13 when I saw my sighting. And I was interested in aircraft then already. So I knew it wasn't an aircraft, it wasn't a glider, it wasn't a balloon, etc. And it was actually in the general vicinity of the flight path to Newcastle Airport. So it was great. I was in this sort of same area, but it clearly wasn't something going into the airport. It just didn't look like anything that was flying.
Yeah.
But I just remember being fairly sort of numb about it. There was no real feeling. It was a case of obviously it caught my eye, but that was all. And even though I was interested in the subject, for some reason, it didn't strike me as being something I really needed to actually look at too deeply and watch it sort of disappear. I can't even remember how I even sort of latched onto it. I didn't see it appear. I just saw it drifting across the sky. And then I didn't even see it disappear out of view. So, and how it left me, it didn't leave me in any way. I didn't feel like it was a kind of profound sighting or a life-changing sighting. And I was probably just too young to sort of appreciate it.
Yeah.
And as for telling people, well, I didn't bother, because it was one of these things where if you told people, they just didn't believe you anyway. You were seeing things, or yeah, nice story, Graeme. What's for tea, sort of thing. So,
so it's interesting that both of you were children when you had your sightings. Have you sort of spoken to other people who maybe have had sightings as adults, and sort of how their experience compares to yours? Is there any different?
I also had one about a year and a half ago, just before I started the podcast. It was funny, the conversation off the back of that is one of the reasons I did start the podcast. If you want, I'll share that. Really funny though, it's probably a very similar place to where Graeme saw his some time ago, because I live just outside of Newcastle now as well, near the airport. So it's an area in Northumberland, and there's a pub called the Snowy Owl that Graeme may be aware of, next to a landmark called Northumberlandia. I was driving home from work, and you know what it's like, the roads, the motorways, the dual carriageways in the UK are always mobbed from 5 till 7 o'clock at night, so you take a back road sometimes, but the back road's like a country road, but it's equally as busy. And I was driving a couple of minutes from where my house is, and it's between like a field and the airport, but the roads are absolutely mobbed, and they're like 60-mile-an-hour roads. And I was driving along, just like you take a turn, then you've got maybe like a 1/10 of a mile stretch of road, that very rough estimate, before you take another turn down to where I would live, and saw kind of 2 points of light in the sky that would be in the sky maybe a couple of 100 feet in the air. I just assumed it was a plane though, like an aircraft, because you're near the airport and driving along. But as I got a little bit further along the road, you kind of notice, like, and again, see, having an interest in UFOs and aliens and all that kind of stuff, like, you do look up a lot more. Like, if people are interested, you do look at the sky a lot more, so you are more likely to see stuff rather than have your head down in your phone all the time. So obviously, when I'm driving, I'm being careful, but these 2 points of light kind of stayed where they were. And as I get a little bit closer, they still looked like they hadn't moved. And I got closer still, and I noticed a white van had pulled over at the side of the road, and the guy was leaning out his window looking up. So as I kind of got closer to realise these 2 points of light were staying still, just as you drive under it, you would never see it against the black night sky, but you could make out the black silhouette triangle. But there was only two lights, just the two lights at the back, not the front. Otherwise, you wouldn't have seen the shape. So I drove underneath this thing, and my first instinct was to phone my wife and commentate on it. And so I phoned her, got along, because it was a hard road to turn round on, given it was so busy. So I pulled into this random, and this is God's honest truth, right? I pulled into this little random house a little bit further along the road, and I'm looking at the thing in my rear view mirror, and it's still just hovering there above these trees that are next to the road. And I'm saying to my wife, there's a black triangle sitting in the sky, literally just a black triangle. You can just see the lights, but it's just above the trees. And she's like, all right, okay. But I was driving, so I can't get my phone to film, and it wouldn't look like much anyway, given it's your camera phone through a window at a distance, right? We all know what that's going to look like. It would never look like anything. So I pulled into this drive, and this old couple came out their kind of farmhouse cottage. Must have been curious as to why someone had pulled onto their drive. And as I'm reversing out, they came out, and the guy was like, can we help you? And I was like, I'm really sorry, I'm just reversing round. I've kind of missed my turn off. And he's like, oh, that's okay. And I was like, I'm looking at that thing along the road, and I pointed back, and you could see this thing still sitting. And I just remember this older guy, he must have been in his 60s or 70s. He kind of looked along and went, oh, yeah. Just shows you there's other things out there, isn't there? And it was just that was his reaction. And he went, good night. And he walked back in his house. And I was like, and my wife heard this on the phone, and she went, what was that? And I went, that was the guy coming out of his house. And so I reversed back onto the road really carefully, because it's a very busy road, and I don't want to get smashed into the back of me. And as I come out back onto the road, it starts moving off diagonally over the trees. So you can see it wasn't going ahead, or it was moving off at a funny angle. But another light had came on at the front, which was like flashing really sporadically, not like in a pattern. It was just a really odd flash, and I remember that. And if you ask about people getting feelings as to what, for no reason whatsoever, I just got the feeling it was like, that's ours. That's like human. For no rhyme or reason, right? But as I got back along, it had moved off over the top of the trees, but it's then a massive expanse of fields. There are no more trees. The trees are a really small section. There was nothing there. I couldn't see anything. I drove back along, and it was either totally black against the sky with no lights, or it was gone. But yeah, that. I got the feeling it was like, that's not alien as such, but it was the weirdest thing to pass under something that is just totally still sitting above the sky. Never heard any more about it. And when I got home and I was telling the wife again about it as I spoke to her, she was just kind of smiling, and she said to me, like, do you know what? You're so passionate about talking about this kind of stuff. Like, you should do that for a job. And it's not what I do for a job, but it was one of the reasons a few months later I started the podcast. And it's kind of kicked on since. And here I am talking to you, gents. So
nice. That's awesome. That's interesting you said that about the black triangle, because from what I've seen from the bit of research that I've done, that seems to be the idea, don't they? That they think either the black triangle is like a reconnaissance craft, or it's like reverse engineered. Or is that not right?
There's various schools of thought as to what they are, and nobody has really come up with a satisfactory explanation as to what they are. So there's one train of thought believes there's some kind of secret tech, whether that's US, British, somewhere else, who knows. There's various stories about what they could be. There's one particular designation for an aircraft, which I'm not going to mention here because Andy gets really triggered every time it gets mentioned. But suffice to say that it was dreamt up by somebody who has been since considered to be not very reliable in the UFO field. So that kind of theory has been discredited over the years. It still pops up from time to time, so that's one thing. And then the other bit, as you say, there could well be something that's been reverse engineered from something that might have crashed or might have been sort of found or whatever. But really, we're still in the dark in terms of what they are. They've been seen plenty of times. They've been seen, for a long time now. There was a big wave in Belgium in the late 1980s of triangular-shaped of aeroforms, for want of a better description. But they've been seen at other times. They've been seen over the North Sea as well, and there was a famous case of somebody I believe on an oil rig. Was that right, Andy? The Royal Observer Corps guy. He saw one in connection with two F-111s in a KC-135 tanker. They would be American aircraft, so that led people to believe it was some kind of super secret US reconnaissance aircraft. But say that nobody really knows. That's the top and bottom of it. People think they know in some cases. People have suggested things, and everybody else is simply in the dark.
I mean, I know what they are. No, I don't. But one of the things that has formed my opinion of what they might be is if you watch the series or anyone's heard of Unidentified, it was on the History Channel. Christopher Mellon, who's the former Under Secretary of Defence for the United States. Now, that is a lofty position. That's not far off of enough people being killed that you're the president, potentially, right? So if anyone's seen Designated Survivor. So he was on an episode of Unidentified with probably the world's foremost expert in black triangular craft, David Marler, and I've interviewed him for my podcast. Really nice guy, really, really interesting. He knows his stuff. And David Marler was talking to Chris Mellon on camera about what he thinks in his research, and the guy's got tens of thousands of documents and all that kind of stuff in his museum, but it's his garage at his house, which looks incredible. And Chris Mellon just stops for a second, and he's got this kind of sparkle in his eye as he's listening to David Marler talk. And Chris Mellon says, "Do you know what I think they might be doing?" And this is a guy who's in a very informed position, and he talks about how these triangles could potentially be surveying the Earth. And when you talk about reconnaissance, he talked about literally mapping the surface of the planet or scanning, because he talks about the movement, that kind of vertical movement on a horizontal movement across the land, the 3 points of light in the corner of these triangles, which is very commonly reported. Just the silence, the way they move, the hovering, all that kind of stuff, and the areas they're generally seen in as well. And I just thought that was really interesting for someone like him to bring up what could be a quite arbitrary opinion. That's probably a little bit of foresight.
Yeah, there's also a very strange kind of phenomenon that they actually project as well. Is so much as you would think you would see from our point of view, you'd see an aerodynamic principle in a triangle. So you'd think the point would go forward, and that would be the direction of travel. But when they're seen a lot of the time, it's actually the kind of blunt end, the straight side of it is leading how they're moving. So that would be quite strange. You've thought about a triangle moving through the air. We would think they would be more aerodynamic to go forward from the point at the front, but that's not how they fly. So there's something quite radical and different there.
Does that suggest then that it's like some kind of advanced like propulsion system, almost one that's like warping space-time almost? Because if it can like move in any direction and not be affected by like aerodynamics or anything, you'd almost have to like argue that it's not being affected by those things, so it's operating outside of those systems.
So the same principles are now being sort of applied to whether people think how the so-called Tic Tac moves, the 47-foot long sort of Tic Tac shaped object is an oblong kind of white object that was seen in the USS Nimitz encounters in 2004.
Are these the ones with
California?
Commander Fravor, yeah?
That's correct, yes. And no doubt we'll get onto that at some stage. Because that had no sort of control services, it had no wings, it had no means of propulsion. The triangles are exactly the same. For what we think was an aircraft or something that flies, a triangle can't fly, especially if these things hover. They don't just fly, they're not just seen flying through the skies, they're seen hovering as well. So you have to think, well, how do they move? Now, we don't have the answers to that because we simply don't have enough information. Yeah. The people who you would think would have the information, the US military, intelligence agency, all the rest of it, we don't even know if they have the information or not.
Well,
so
even with like the Nimitz stuff, didn't that show that some of the aircrafts were like trans-medium as well? Like they were flying through air, water, space.
Yeah, so the objects initially were tracked, or they were at points tracked coming in from an altitude of 80,000 feet, but since there's not been a solid confirmation, but I spoke to some of the guys who are radar operators as well on board the Nimitz and the Princeton, and they have mentioned other agencies were also tracking these objects as well. So when you look up and down the coast of the US, there's a lot of like missile defense, all that kind of stuff that you don't know exists, but it exists, or you shouldn't know exists, or where it is.
It's there, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and these things apparently also track these objects coming in from far higher, i.e., space. So if these things can come in from space, whether they are traveling a great distance or they're just appearing, or they were somewhere else on the planet and went into space, nobody knows. But then they're coming down, dropping from 80,000 feet to just above the sea, the level of the sea, in just under 2 seconds. And then moving about really erratically like a ping pong ball in a glass, and then potentially disappearing off into the water at some point as well. yeah, that's where you look at that transmedium travel, air, water, space, and there's also reports of a lot of these objects moving through solids like rock or mountains as well. And just to go back on, you're talking about propulsion. I think there's a couple of things, like, for example, not to go into loads of stuff and it's all just theories and whatnot as well, but like we talk about these things about the propulsion or how they fly, but that's based on our understanding of how something flies. These things might not even be flying. You know, that's what we don't know. It's like they're just doing something that to us we classify as it is flying or it's hovering, right? Like a fish isn't flying through the water. It just, you know, it's like different dimensions in the water. It moves up and down at different angles. It might just be the same for these craft. Bob Lazar famously talked about some of these objects being able to move because they can warp the space-time in front of them, like you mentioned. And it's akin to, imagine placing a bowling ball or a really heavy ball on a mattress. Now, that's going to be hard for you to shift or move. The easiest way to actually move it is not touch the ball at all, but if you put your fist down on the mattress in front of the ball falls forward. And if you keep moving your fists forward and one in front of the other, the ball will just perpetually fall. And there's a lot of potential that these objects, that's how they move. Like Buzz Lightyear said it best, falling with style. And if you can control that, that's how these things may potentially be propelled and move through the air. So a lot of really interesting theories on that, yeah.
A lot of the kind of when you hear skeptics talking about whether, you know, things like this are possible in terms of like visitation from somewhere else, we're not saying even that's the case, but if it is, then a lot of skeptics will say, well, it's not possible. But they're actually looking at everything through what's known at the moment about how people can travel, you know, all this kind of thing about warp bubbles and all the rest of it. And there's a bit of a kind of not invented here syndrome. So if they can't think of it, it can't be possible. Well, surely that can't be, you know, correct. Because if you took an iPhone and give it to Isaac Newton and said, you know, have a look at that, mate, see what that is and see if you can work it, he couldn't. He wouldn't be able to you know, comprehend what it was, never mind how to use it, especially if the battery was dead. So, you know, so why can't you use that kind of thinking today? Because the things that we know now, in 100 years' time, 1,000 years' time, will be radically different.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Exactly.
So
that's
gone. No, sorry. That's the kind of argument we're trying to get across to people, that just because we don't know it's possible doesn't mean you say it isn't possible. And so everything has to be kept on the table. You can't rule things out just because we can't replicate it. And that's part of where I believe a lot of skeptics sort of go wrong in terms of applying conventional wisdom to a lot of things that seem to be, well, impossible, basically. But just because we can't dream of it and we can't replicate it doesn't mean you say somebody else hasn't.
No, yeah, I'd agree with you. And I think as well, I think humans have a tendency as well of thinking that everything's quite linear as well. And people have to kind of remember that, like, not all the planets started at the same times, and not evolution and everything kind of kicked off at the same time. And there could be a civilization out there that's had 1 million years more time than we have, or there could even be civilizations that are just starting out now, and we're the crazy high-tech civilizations compared to them. So I think it's just one of those things that where people, like you're saying, they kind of just need to be open-minded, and just because it's not a thing yet doesn't mean that it won't be. And it's like you're saying, like, even if you took a car back like 1,000 years, they wouldn't have any understanding on how the combustion worked in the engine or anything, and they'd think that it was complete magic, but you'd understand it. So I get you on that point.
Yeah. Andy, do you want to touch on the ultra-terrestrials and the time travelers as well? Because there's those strands as well, isn't there?
I just wrote Wakanda down. So I suppose when you start talking about this kind of stuff, a lot of people have seen Black Panther, you know, Marvel movies and stuff, and you look at the idea behind Wakanda, which I'm probably preaching to the choir for you guys as well, is there's another civilization which is based here on Earth, which is far more technologically advanced, but they live here and we can't see them. We don't know they're here, and that's a good possibility for what these things might be. That's obviously very Earth-based, though, that Wakanda's still here, it's just hidden. And then you hear things in the past like Atlantis, that there was a civilization that got lost underwater, you know, all that kind of stuff. And more we're seeing that these objects are going under the water. There's various, you know, there's millions of lava tubes all around the planet and underwater
I was going to ask you about this. I was going to ask you about this, actually. What is your what is your guys' opinions on this one? So these crafts that are allegedly showing up, do you think they are from another planet, or do you think that they have always been here? Because there's a lot of like talk online that they haven't come here, they've always been here kind of thing. And I just would be interested in seeing what you guys have to say about that.
Do you want me to kick off, Graeme?
Yeah, please.
So I think it's one of those, like, is it aliens from other planets, future us, you know, different realities, they're already here? I think it's all of the above. I think that's why it's different phenomena. I think people think we have aliens coming from another planet to visit us, right? That there's probably an element of that, but maybe some of those type of objects are drones, and that's why they travel at the speed they do, they move the way they do. It's some kind of artificial intelligence. That tic-tac might not necessarily have anything inside of it, right? We've got probes, Voyager probes, just past the outer edge of our solar system some time ago, which is now just flying through space with all kinds of weird stuff on it, right? That potentially is going to end up on another planet or something at some point in the very distant future. We don't know. We've also got a rover just kicking about on Mars, okay? I mean, people think, why would aliens send spacecraft millions of miles, hundreds of millions of miles, billions of miles to come here, fly about the desert or some trailer park in Texas, right? And just say hello to someone, then leave, okay? We have sent a rover to Mars, which is just driving about very slowly in a crater. And now we've got a little toy helicopter flying up and down on it as well. So if you were on Mars, right, and you saw that and tried to tell someone, there's a little robot out there just driving about, and then every so often a little helicopter comes up and goes back down, they would say, why would another planet or civilization send that millions of miles to here, land it, and then just drive about a crater? Well, why indeed? So we're doing it. You know, we're spending a lot of money doing it in a very basic way, as advanced as the technology is for us. So I think there's a lot of things happening. I think you've got different realities that maybe share our same space. And I think that's where, not to jump all over the place, but the nuclear aspect or nuclear entities maybe have is if they share the same sort of space-time as us, and we start setting off nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons back in the late 40s through the 50s, 60s, 70s, it starts to have a ripple through that space-time. And when you start knocking on the door of different realities, if you've seen things like Fringe, or if you've watched Tenet, you know, different realities running backwards simultaneous to ours, all these are like real theories and possibilities. And I think there's a whole lot of things happening. And that's what I even start to think about. Do some of these things even know each other exist? Some of them might like us, some of them might not. Some of them might not actually care otherwise. You know, I think there's a lot of different things at play.
Well, this was gonna be another quick question that I wanted to ask as well, because there seems to be kind of like 3 different narratives that are like being painted for like the whole extraterrestrial view. And what it seems like is the main one is like they're in our airspace, we're not sure if it's a threat, and that seems to be like what To the Stars and everybody are doing, and like with the 60 Minutes and everything. But then you also have the other side of it where it's this I can't think of what the word is. It's kind of like more like, would you call it metaphysics-y? Kind of like this aspect of
higher consciousness.
Yeah. I can't really think of what the right word is for it, but like this idea that it's just humans that are more consciously evolved than we are, and they're like time traveling, if that makes sense, to this point in time because of something. This is something that I was seeing on Twitter, but I don't know how legitimate that is. But yeah,
any of them could be true. If you ask this question about, you know, who do you think, or where do you think they're from, if you'd asked that about 35 to 40 years ago, the answer would have been aliens, because all the books back then, all the kind of all the interviews, they all suggested that it was somebody from somewhere else coming here to see what we were doing.
Yeah.
That thinking has changed because people have been a bit more open-minded nowadays, and it's evolved to all the things that Andy's been mentioning there, all the things you've been mentioning. But also, you have to think that it could be something else completely that nobody's considered yet. There's no instruction manual to this as to what, you know, how it all works and how it unfolds. There's no kind of history to it that, you know, someone you can read and find out how it evolved. So we're simply in the dark. I know it sounds like a bit of a cop out, but genuinely nobody's an expert in this field. Nobody knows where they're from. Nobody knows what they are, whether they're us in the future, whether they're coming from some of those kind of realm, whether they're coming from the past, the future, some other planet. Who knows? Nobody's an expert. Nobody has the goods on it. Nobody has any kind of idea. People say they do, A lot of people will give you chapter and verse as to what they represent and what their motives are and all the rest of it. But that's possibly their experience or their opinions, or something they might be even made up. Who knows? But nobody actually has any kind of handle on this yet. There's simply not enough information out there.
Yeah.
And that's partly the reason why we exist, is to try and push for more information to be given, more people to discuss it, to be discussed at a much higher level than we are. The people who can influence it, the people who can make decisions, the people who can allocate funding and resources to studying it. So yeah, we're as much as in the dark possible, and actually we could be as much in the dark as the experts could be. Just because they have more resources than we have doesn't mean to say they've got more knowledge than us at the end of the day. That's another thing to consider as well.
Yeah. I tell you what really piqued my curiosity with all of this was what you were just mentioning, Andy, about the nuclear stuff that they're interested in, because to me that's quite interesting, because it's almost kind of like, as silly as a reference as this is, like with Star Trek, like when the species gets warp drive capability, they're allowed to join the Federation.
The Federation.
Yeah, and I know there's been a lot of talk online with this whole like Galactic Federation and all this stuff coming out with all these articles.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I find it interesting with the nuclear side of it, because like if you were to put yourself in those shoes and say, like, if you were an advanced like race and you were like traversing the stars, you would probably sit down and make like a set of like rules and be like, right, so once these civilizations get to this point, we'll go and check on them. We'll make sure that they're not doing anything they shouldn't be or putting the universe at risk or anything like that. And it's interesting that when we started doing all of our nuclear tests and bombs and stuff, that's kind of when all of these kind of like aircrafts and everything started showing up.
See if as a species, right, and we're like, we would say we are the dominant, as far as we know, species on this planet, right? That's debatable sometimes, or the most intelligent. Imagine one day we catch on that dolphins have got their own nuclear weapons program, okay? I'm just picking dolphins totally at random. What do you think we would go and do to all the dolphins?
We'd fly in there and check them out first and see what they were using them for.
And then we'd probably get rid of the dolphins. If we clacked on that, do you know what, we don't like what they are doing, much like what countries do, interpersonally, that we don't like what that country is doing and they shouldn't have that nuclear weapons program or that nuclear power program, so we're going to stop them. And like you say, we don't know that a more advanced species, whether they share this planet, they share this reality or space, or otherwise, are looking going, no, it's like the kids have found the matches, and that's what happened in the 40s when we started blowing up atomic bombs and testing ranges and Hiroshima. And that's, again, I don't think it's coincidental that Roswell happened not long after. And also there's been other cases highlighted more recently, and then those continued. And things like the World War II, and Graeme knows a lot about things like Foo Fighters, not the Dave Grohl band, of course, but, the actual Foo Fighters that were spotted, and there's sightings going back even like World War I as well. So these things have got a vested interest in what we're doing, probably for good reason, in the same way that we would be when we stick monkeys in a zoo and watch how they habitate and how they get on, and what happens when we introduce something else, or look, this one can use an iPhone. It's like, that's essentially what we're doing. We're messing about with technology. We don't necessarily understand totally what we're doing with it.
Yeah, no, that's good.
There's certainly cases around where they've been seen to interfere with nuclear weapons silos and installations, not just in America, but also in Russia. There have been cases of they've even been deactivated or activated as well. So there have been various stories throughout the years about that. And you're right, that, there was this kind of explosion in terms of numbers of sightings after 1945. So it's a good sort of theory. And as Andy says, it's probably no coincidence that there was a major rash of sightings in the late 40s. But then again, you have to remember that the atomic weapons program didn't just start with the first atomic bomb. They were planning it for years beforehand. So it may be that whatever's watching us, if that's the case, I'm not saying it is, but if that's the case, maybe they were aware that there was some kind of race to build one. So therefore, they were coming much earlier than that. And it may be that we're just a warlike species and they're coming to study us, and for that reason and that reason only.
Yeah.
But any of those theories is as good as any other.
Well, yeah, you could
also.
Okay.
where we're using kind of anthropomorphic kind of like, sort of feelings towards trying to work out what their motives are. We're looking at it through our eyes. We can't see it through their eyes if they even have eyes. So we're just projecting our kind of thoughts and theories onto them, if there is a them.
No, that's a very good point, and they could have evolved up into a civilization that doesn't have any violence either. So they could literally just be interested in our violent culture that we have, and they can't understand why we do what we do. But
very true.
No, that's a very interesting point. But I don't know. I just find it really interesting because it's weird how they spiked after that, isn't it? It's unusual. I wonder what the ties are with that one.
Can I mention, Jacob, you mentioned the threat aspect of things, right? And Luis Elizondo, who ran the ATIP program, that's the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification program for the US government and the Pentagon 2012 to 2017, which kicked off a lot of what's happening, and we'll get to talking about UAP media and how that kind of evolved. But Luis Elizondo talked about, and there's a lot of controversy on the whole threat thing, because if these things are so advanced, they would have came in and wiped us out by now if they wanted to, and all that kind of stuff, right? And the way they talk about threat is slightly differently, because if I'll ask like Matty, hi, like if you go to bed at night, right, and you woke up in the morning and you look about your sitting room, your living room, just depending on where people are listening to this in the world, and you saw a load of muddy footprints all over the house, right? Nothing was stolen, nothing was taken, you hadn't been broken into, but someone had been in your house through the night. How would you feel?
You'd immediately feel scared. I think part of that is a sort of uncertainty about what their intentions are, but you immediately think, oh, someone is trying to steal something or attack me, because that is, I think,
what it's very human. Yeah. But that's it. But they've not done anything. They've not taken anything. They've not damaged anything. There's just evidence that they more than likely were there. You've not seen them, but that's essentially what Lou talks about when it comes to muddy footprints through the house. Like, these things are here. They seem to have capabilities we don't. They have intentions we don't understand necessarily. And like Graeme said earlier, that absolutely warrants scientific analysis, serious investigation, proper media coverage, mainstream media coverage, which we're very, very slowly starting to get. It's been a lot more prevalent in the United States. And it's a very British thing. I think that the conversations took a lot longer to start to break into the media over here now.
No, that's
true.
That's a good point. I was going to say as well, it's a PR nightmare, really, isn't it, for like Western culture, because effectively the American government's been caught with like their pants down, because they've got two options. They either go, we don't have the capability to stop what's ever in our airspace, or we go, it could be little green men, but we're not sure. And it's like, it's a horrible situation for them to be in, really, because like they either have to admit that they haven't got the capability to protect their own airspace to the world, which they're obviously not going to do to like China and Russia. And then you've also got the other side of it too, where it could actually be ETs or something, and none of the other countries are communicating with each other either. It's just really muddy water, isn't it?
For a long time I thought, like Graeme says, you think for a long time one thing, and then as you get into the subject, you hear more, you explore more, you research. And I used to think it was quite simple, that, for example, the US, the Russians, the Chinese, they know what's going on, and it's all a big cover-up for the technology. And I think that's a little bit of it. The technology is a huge part, but I reckon it's more than likely a lot of this, they don't know what's going on, and that's why it's covered up, because they're scared. And if you're meant to protect the people, or you want to protect your country, especially the superpowers, from the other ones, then you don't know what this outside force of nature potentially is. And that's probably more scary for them, that they don't know its capabilities or the intentions, or they know little bits and pieces. And I think that's why in the background it's potentially been trying to be pieced together. But it's starting to come to the forefront now that, do you know what, this is happening. It's a reality. Let's just try and establish how we can study this going forward more out in the open.
Imagine go back to the Cold War and the amount of money that both the Americans and the Russians spent trying to work out what each other had in terms of weapons and intelligence capabilities. Now apply that to now and think about the same thing of them doing it to whatever these things represent. And they're probably in the dark, as Andy says. And that's my opinion as well. I've come to that opinion over years, but that is my opinion, that they simply don't really know much more than we do. They may have data, but what that data means is probably nothing. because they can't, where it's Isaac Newton's sort of level with the iPhone, we simply don't have the tools, the resources, or the knowledge. We're not at the level yet to understand it. And that'll frighten them, because for the first time in their existence, they don't have a handle of what the other side's doing. It was always the same in the Cold War. They didn't always knew exactly what other sides were doing, but they had a pretty good idea. It was all relative, and it was something that could work out in the end. But this is something completely different. And if that is the case, if these are from somewhere else, or some other time, or some other realm, then this will probably scare them to death. And that'll be part of the reason why there is so much secrecy, because one, they can't admit failure to themselves, never mind to anybody else, but also because other governments, they might think they have an inside track. Because if the Americans are looking into it, you'll be damn sure that the Russians and the Chinese and everybody else will be as well. And the first to get a hold of this technology and exploit it, if that's the case, they could rule the world.
Oh yeah, it's game over, isn't it? Really, whoever
exactly. Imagine if the Chinese get a hold of it, or the Russians get a hold of it, or the Americans get a hold of it. You know, it's a game changer for all of them. So there's all these other things to consider. None of that, you know, all of that might be completely wrong, but it's a good thing to talk about and discuss.
Can I add one thing to that as well? And it's just a little bit to think about is, so you talk about the technology and the military aspect of it as well, okay? And no doubt the Russians and the Chinese, again, we're talking about the superpowers, could be Jamaican, Scottish, whatever, right? The Estonians might be involved, who knows? But we talk about America, Russia, and China. Like, it would make sense that if you can't understand it, you might as well lead the narrative and be the first one to really come out in the open about it. And maybe that's where the Americans are trying here to, do you know what? Let's try and control this as best we can and be a little bit more open. And that's why we're starting to see the conversation we're seeing. Or the danger is that the Chinese come out first and go, do you know what? We have had these incursions, we have had these encounters, and we then find out about the Chinese Navy or submarine contacts or what they have seen or found in space. Same with the Russians, and then it would make sense that one of those would want to control that first. Or you sit back, the other two might be sitting back and going, let's see what the Americans do here.
Do you think there's maybe a case here of, if you just imagine China, if they thought that it was the Americans, they would try to, I'd think they'd try to kick up a fuss about it. Do you think it's maybe all three, just thinking of superpowers, they each think that the others have got it and want to keep quiet to protect their own interests so they don't look bad compared to one another? Or do you genuinely think that none of them have any idea what's going on at all?
I think, like Graeme said, that they've got an idea probably of what each other has in terms of secret technology. Was it a couple of weeks ago? Graeme will correct me if I'm wrong, probably, but China had some sort of expo that demonstrated, here's our latest cutting-edge military technology. Mm-hmm. No country with the right mind demonstrates its latest cutting-edge. What they show you is, here's the stuff that we want to show you. They don't show you the stuff that's probably operating or like 30, 40, 50 years in advance of what they actually have. So they've probably all got a rough idea of what each other has, and that's where you've got counterintelligence and intelligence agencies, right? I think when it comes to the phenomenon aspect of this, not the military stuff that's more terrestrial, but the actual stuff they don't understand, I think that they know that it's not each other. And that's where I even wonder, in the background, is there any level where the Russians, Chinese, the Americans, the British do talk to each other? As a, do you know what? Imagine them meeting up totally off the record. Like, have you seen this? Yeah, we have these encounters, and yeah, we had our nukes turned off recently. Yeah, do you know what? We had the same thing with this. That might happen. You know, that kind of off the table conversation in small groups, small sects somewhere. Who knows? But I genuinely think the three of them look at this and go, they've probably all got their own technology. They've probably all got their own crashes. The Russians and the Chinese are probably better at keeping that stuff secret than the US. I think the British are better at keeping anything like that secret than the US.
I was going to ask you actually in a minute about British special teams and stuff.
Before you go on to that, I think if you look at the timeline of ufology, it was back in the war when the Foo Fighters were a thing. Everybody thought they were German secret weapons or Japanese secret weapons because they were equally seen in the Pacific as well as Europe. And then you go into the time of Roswell. Now, the Americans thought that they were German technology that was being developed by the Russians and captured after the war. But then that didn't turn out to be the case because it couldn't be proven. So you can see this progression. So German to Russian, and then in the Cold War, they realized it wasn't each other's technology either, because obviously they just weren't seeing it being developed. and it didn't have a red star in it. It didn't have the stars and stripes on it. So yes, they must have come to a conclusion, if that's the case, very early on. You're talking maybe the 50s, the 60s, that it wasn't each other's tech. So that conversation will have been, if it happened between the superpowers, that'll have happened a long time ago. But chances are they'll just be no further forward. There's all this extra information coming out now, but I suspect it's not getting them anywhere.
Sounds like what the planet really needs, if anything, is like a one world government almost, don't we? We just need everybody to work together.
Just needs people to be more open. That's all. Much more open with the information.
I swear I heard something on To the Stars Media, but I could be wrong. Aren't they working on like artificial intelligence or something that's going to be taking in all of the data, like all of the people, like when people like film their UFO like experiences and stuff?
I think you're talking about the Vault and the Scout app.
Yes.
That was doing the rounds. I think given To the Stars Academy started with Tom DeLonge, Blink-182, former, I'm a fan of Blink-182 from back in the day, my soundtrack to my childhood, right? And he's got a massive interest in UFOs, and that obviously straight away people go, what, the guy from Blink-182, the where are you guy, right? So he then managed to get together this group of very serious former military officials, your Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Jim Semivan, Hal Puthoff, and a host of others, Steve Justice, and there's a couple other people involved as well. Now, the idea being they got these videos declassified as part of this group. They were moving things forward. And then last year, the group rather suddenly decided to change direction, where To the Stars are now going for a much more entertainment-based division. And maybe a lot of the promises or things they talked about aren't necessarily going to still come to fruition. Tom still talks about getting the message out there about different ideas and technologies or what might be out there through movies and books in that way, whereas Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, as I've said themselves, aren't entertainers. They're not interested in sitting making movies or that kind of stuff. They want to do this politically, so they came away from it and have forged ahead doing their own thing. So those technologies, I think there are different iterations of them out there, and it's not to say that they won't happen. I don't know if Graeme knows any more, but I think it was one of those things that had a lot more likelihood with the people that were attached to it than when To the Stars and the other guys kind of left.
Yeah, I can't see it going any further now. Given what Andy said and the breakup of the original team there, I can't see that progressing any further than it actually did.
It had two separate teams, didn't it? It had a media team and like a laboratory team or a research team, didn't it?
You had To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, you had To the Stars Media. It was all under the To the Stars umbrella, yeah. With the idea was that there was still very much a media section. That's where you've got the Secret Machines books, Gods and War. You've got the idea they were always going to produce movies. They had the Unidentified series was part of that as well. But Lou and Chris Mellon and those guys always were very much, we want to do the real serious political stuff. And I think in 2021, you've still got to acknowledge things like social media and the TikTok generation, right? I don't get TikTok. However, there's a massive audience there that if you put a 30-second or 15-second snippet of Obama talking about aliens, that gets millions of views overnight, as opposed to me dropping a podcast on it that 10,000 people hear. Yeah. So there's different audiences, and I think that's what To the Stars acknowledged, that we can attack this via different avenues. And when you look at Hollywood through the years, and I'm talking about this coming up soon on my podcast, right, the phenomenon and how it's represented through movies, it could be a way of softening the blow or getting people ready for what might come out in the future as well. If you've seen the latest trailer for The Eternals,
yes,
it's a big triangle craft appears out of nowhere.
I was literally just about to mention it to you when you started bringing up Wakanda a minute ago. I was like, I'm going to bring up the Eternals trailer at the end of this podcast because it's a black triangle that shows up to ancient humanity.
But what a great way to kind of get in people's minds that that's how you see it, and that's where this stuff happens. We've all seen Independence Day and all that kind of stuff, but there's different ways to kind of push this stuff on people and what might be happening. So that's still potentially a story being told. And I'm not saying the Marvel movies are what's happening, right? I'm not saying Thanos is coming with his Infinity Gauntlet like that. Hope not. But there's still a decent way to get in touch with different aspects of society and people's interests through different forms of media. But yeah, I can't see.
All you've got to do is plant a thought, and you can change somebody's life.
Yeah,
and then they can go on and change everybody else's lives around them too. So,
absolutely.
So we probably should talk a little bit about UAP Media UK then. So
Please.
what is it? What's the goal? What are you guys trying to do?
So, off the back of the US having this huge movement through Lou Elizondo and To the Stars Academy, the UK, as always, kind of goes hand in hand with the US, don't we? We're seen as the kind of lesser sibling of the relationship as such in a lot of different things. They had this really open conversation. The mainstream media started picking up segments, and guys like Chris Mellon and others were appearing on really serious segments on Fox News, CNN, and they started having those conversations. New York Times were doing front page headlines. The UK, dead silence. You know, anything in the UK press, it was usually tabloids, Daily Star, The Sun, those kind of Daily Sport, for God's sake, you know. And it would be pages with the X-Files logo and usually Nick Pope accompanying the article.
Yeah.
Any segments are usually the last part on the news, with the newsreader kind of having a bit of a laugh and a giggle, you know. And finally, flying saucer flies across the screen, you know, daft logo, all that kind of stuff. And it's some, for lack of a better term, nut job who is talking about some crazy experience that's probably more psychological than anything else. And nothing was happening in the UK about it, and that was really frustrating. And basically, long story-ish short, I was speaking to my kind of regular co-host Dan one day about and someone in the UK was making an appearance on talk radio. It then got moved from talk radio to talk sport. Now, I'm a football fan and I listen to talk sport, and I know that the sports bar 10 to 1's a bit of a lad's show. It's London cabbies phoning up talking about the West Ham result, all that kind of stuff. And they moved this guy on to talk about his serious, in quotation marks, experiences with alien beings on this show, and he got ripped to shreds, right? And it was just taking the mick out the subject, and it's that kind of, you don't want to hear it. So I basically said to him, do you know what, it'd be great if these organizations had someone or somewhere they could go to get serious quotes about the subject, but also we can talk about it maybe from a younger generation's point of view. Not that I'm 35, right? And I appreciate Graeme's like 50-ish, I'll say Graeme, but they're still not that old hardcore or, you know, kind of nut jobs that you want to say, or whatever, like a craziness. Just for comments and quotes, if they wanted to talk about it seriously, given what's happening in the US and where we could see things going. So we got in touch with a couple of guys we know, Dave Partridge, who does Shadows of Your Mind magazine, Adam Goldsack. He's done a lot of activism. He was one of the first activists, especially from a UK point of view, when it comes to UFOs, you know, lobbying politicians and writing and all that kind of stuff. And it's sort of evolved from there, where we've got Graeme on board and Chris as well, who have added their expertise from different fields, where we're basically a small organisation where groups like the BBC last week reached out. I've got different really serious journalists now reaching out as well, asking for quotes, asking for contacts, not necessarily always wanting to speak to us, and that's absolutely fine, but they're coming to us and asking, who should we speak to about this? Where can we go for a quote? And we can send them all over, like, especially we've got a lot of contacts in the States now as well. And now you're starting to see not only the US having these massive media pieces, mainstream serious pieces talking about UAPs or UFOs. It's now, in the recent weeks, coming to the UK, where you're starting to see a lot of social media chatter on, should we be looking at this more seriously? You know, we joke about it, but actually Biden's talking about it, Obama's talking about it, Trump talked about it.
Yeah.
Because the US is taking it seriously, we're really late to the party, but that the idea being that, do you know what, if we could be the first ones to say, UAP Media UK, if you want to know anything about the subject, get in touch. We're on Twitter, we've got websites, all that kind of stuff, but we've got databases with different journalists who'll talk about it. We're reaching out to politicians. I say we, right? I do the least work of any of the guys in the group, like all the rest of them do that. And if, like I say, Dan, Adam, Chris, Graeme, Dave do a lot of work in the background, speaking to different contacts. And that allows us to build a really solid database from the UK point of view, that when you're ready, and I think they are starting to get there, to have this conversation about what these objects may or may not be and how we can go about investigating that and getting involved, then there's a solid database of information already there.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. It's been a long time coming, this, in terms of a requirement for the UK media to have people to go to find the best sources of information. Now, we're not necessarily saying that we are that source of information, but we certainly have access to people who can provide the quotes, can provide the interviews straight away. And from quite a sort of standing start. We've seen the BBC, it's not the British media, sorry, have just had no coverage, but now there's a bit of a trickle, and hopefully that trickle will become a flood. You would see on BBC that there would be nothing, and when the videos have been released recently of the triangles flying over the American destroyers and the one that went into the ocean, the object that went into the ocean, there was nothing on the BBC at all, even though they cover the American news. And those stories were featured quite prominently on the American news networks. There was nothing on the BBC, and yet when Obama was interviewed on the Late Late Show, then that did actually cause them to mention something on Radio 4, I believe, the other morning, and also there was a Newsnight segment as well with a journalist from the New Yorker who had written quite a long piece about the history of ufology. So it is starting. But we hope just to keep that momentum going, and if when journalists do need somebody, then yes, we're hoping that they're going to come to us, and we're trying to push information their way so that they don't forget as well, because news cycles, as people, things go out of the news quite quickly, but it's just trying to make sure that just keeps there all the time, and every time there's something new happens, we want to make sure that they're aware of it so they don't forget, they don't move on to other things, and they don't sideline us.
So what's your sort of ultimate end goal and motivation? Do you just want people to be having a conversation, get on the news? Are you more interested in getting sort of funding and research into this, or are you ultimately motivated that you want an answer, you want to know what these things are?
It's a bit of everything, really. We're not the best people to be able to find out what these things are, whether they've got some kind of prosaic, mundane explanation, or whether secret tech, or whether they're from somewhere else. That's not really our job. We're not specialists in that kind of field. But we'd hope to be able to get a conversation with people who make decisions, allocate funding, and actually can do that kind of work. So there's one side of things, but also that's in the future. At the moment, it's just getting the media to be able to stimulate that kind of conversation, and then to get that kind of conversation elevated to the people who actually can make decisions along those lines. So the people in the military, the people in politics, the people who influence public opinion. We have to get them on board first before we can even think about anything else. It's a series of steps, and at the moment we're still on the bottom, of the staircase, on bottom of the ladder. We're still trying to make sure that the media get involved in a serious way, not, as Andy says, in a jokey way at the end of the news and the X-Files music and Little Green Men and all the rest of it. That type of conversation, unfortunately, is still happening. So you'll get segments where they might still think about, the Newsnight segment that had a picture of a revolving flying saucer at the back of the studio, and that's not really, it should be a serious issue. When we're not making light of it, that there's something serious here to look at. We don't want to have that kind of sort of jokey, marginalized conversation that people can just laugh off after a few minutes. We want it to be a topic of conversation the next morning in the office or around the dinner table. So it just makes sure. So if one person talks to somebody else about it, and then they talk to somebody else again, we want that kind of conversation. The sort of conversation you have about EastEnders the night before, or watching Rangers, or West Ham, or whatever. Those kind of conversations. We'd like to see that happen amongst the general public, and then hopefully that wave of kind of tide of talk about the subject will then influence people who are in a much better position to be able to do something about it.
Just out of curiosity, you mentioned the US is sort of already starting to make sort of leeway in getting people talking and getting on news. Do you know how this compares to Russia and China? But do you know if they're sort of ahead of us?
Yeah, so the US, back in December, they have a bill going through Senate where they kind of lay out plans for what's coming up next year and things that have to be invested in, funded, all that kind of stuff for various different subjects. And one of them that made its way into the Senate bill that was approved was a task force report, a UAP task force to be established and reported. And the report would be a declassified analysis of what the DoD and those various departments had on UFOs, basically. So the government themselves were going, do you know what? Let's publish something that says, what have we got here? What have we been investigating? What have we been looking at? What is the data? Is there a threat to our military or our soldiers, our personnel, people? What's going on? which is really exciting, because that's the kind of first time that's really happened at that level since Project Blue Book back in the days, where the military had their own sort of mini investigation. But the purpose of that was to poo-poo and downplay all of this. What we've got is this report happening that we hope comes out with. It's not going to come out and say, here's the aliens, or here's what these are, okay? What we expect, or I think the best case scenario would be, there would be some sort of analysis where there's maybe a bullet point conclusion that it could be a foreign adversary that has a multi-generational leap in technology that means there's been serious intelligence failings from a US point of view. It's probably the biggest since 9/11, or the biggest in human history, and we have to work out how we fell so far behind. A couple of other things, but ultimately something that says this is potentially something else, i.e. a non-human intelligence, which requires further serious funding, further study, with the idea that a UAP task force is set up permanently going forward. That's what we're kind of hoping comes out of this, that there's further study and funding allocated to working out what this kind of stuff is. As far as we know, Russia and China have never had that, at least not openly anyway. And that's where this is now happening publicly. No doubt that kind of stuff may have happened in some small way in the background. And like we talked about ATIP, that was a government-funded program that was investigating UFO encounters back in 2012 to 2017. This is the first time it's happening publicly.
Yeah, if the Russians and Chinese at the moment are investigating it, they're keeping it very quiet, and probably for good reasons in terms of, you know, what they're trying to achieve. However, they have, or certainly the Russians have had an organized sort of UFO hunt, if you like. It happened quite a long time ago. It was back in the days of the Soviet Union. There was an order went out to all their air defense units to basically collate sightings and report them on a kind of countrywide basis. But that was an internal thing in terms of the military, and it only came out years later that all their Air Force units and all their missile installations and all the rest of it had to report sightings of UFOs. And whatever that, what they did with that information, then who knows? And it's never been really made public. But so there have been programs, you know, internally where they've looked at this kind of thing. But what they're doing now, yeah, you can tell, you could tell us as much as we can, because that information is simply not coming out of those countries. Now, they may not be even doing anything about it, but chances are if the Americans are, then they are looking at it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Well, we've ran over a little bit, so we might have to call it a day there, if that's all right with you guys. But do you want to just give a little shout to your socials where people can find you and go and check you out?
Yeah, certainly. So my writing you can find at uapmedia.uk, but also if you look at my Twitter account, which is at Borders750, there's a Linktree link on there which shows everything I've written for the UFO subject, not just you know, on UAP Media, but elsewhere, and including the Foo Fighters article which I had on the Debrief website, which Chris Mellon, who was mentioned before, he actually endorsed it as well. So that was quite nice of him.
Awesome.
You can follow at UAP Media UK on Twitter and on other socials as well. If you're into podcasts, which given you are listening to this, hopefully we've not turned you off. The guys obviously do a great job on Infinite Void. Then you can check my podcast out, that UFO podcast, and I'm on Twitter at UFO UAP AM, or you can check out that UFOpodcast.com. And a lot of the people we have talked about, or incidents or cases, or for up-to-date news, is all on the podcast as well. So it'd be great if people would check that out.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for coming on. Everyone that's listening, go over and check out their stuff. Go and give them a follow and show your support. And thank you guys for coming on. It's been a really good conversation.
Look forward to part 2.
Hey everyone, we wanted to take a moment to tell you about our brand new Patreon page.
Yeah, so we've devised a load of new goodies that are neatly packaged across 3 different tiers for you.
Tiers start at £3 and go all the way up to £10 a month.
Just to say, the Patreon is in no way an obligation, and we're going to continue making the podcast as it is, freely available across all the platforms. But if you'd like to support us and show your support, you can now.
So yeah, head over to patreon.com/Infinite Void Pod for more information.